It was one of those quiet mornings where everything in the yard felt already in place before you even noticed it. The air was still, just cool enough to hold the faint sound of leaves shifting along the fence line, and the feeder hung motionless beneath a pale sky that hadn't fully decided to brighten yet. A chickadee appeared the way they usually do, small and quick, almost expected, landing on the same thin branch just beyond the feeder. At first, nothing about it felt unusual, but then it didn't move. Not in the way birds hesitate for safety, but in a slower, more deliberate stillness, as if the moment itself had been paused. Its head tilted slightly, not scanning for food, not scanning for danger, but holding on something you could not quite name. And then it looked toward you. Not briefly, not nervously, longer than it needed to. A second too long to ignore, yet too subtle to fully explain. You might have told yourself it meant nothing. Just a bird, just coincidence. But something about the timing felt off, like it had arrived with awareness instead of instinct. And if you're new to this space, take a moment and subscribe before you go deeper, because what seems like a simple backyard moment begins to unfold into something far less ordinary, and once you start noticing it, it becomes impossible to unsee. The chickadee remains there, balanced perfectly, as if measuring the space between movement and intention, and then it shifts slightly, not away from you, but sideways, adjusting its position like it is re-evaluating what it sees rather than where it is going. The yard feels the same, but something in it doesn't. The silence between sounds feels thinner, more intentional, as if even the wind has slowed to observe the moment with you. And that was the first time it felt like you were not just watching the bird, but being watched back in a way that carried weight without explanation, because what happens next begins to suggest this was never about coincidence at all. And as you stood there without really moving, something subtle began to settle in, not as a thought at first, but as a feeling that you could not immediately translate into words. It was the sense that you had seen this kind of moment before, not in this exact yard, not with this exact bird, but in small fragments scattered across ordinary days that never felt important enough to remember. The way a bird pauses just a little longer than expected on a fence post. The way it seems to hesitate right before it decides whether to stay or leave. The way you sometimes catch yourself wondering if it noticed you at all, even though it is clearly looking in your direction. Most people would never call it meaningful. They would say it is just behavior, just instinct, just coincidence layered on top of coincidence. But you know the feeling, even if you never admitted it out loud. That slight uncertainty when something alive seems to register your presence in a way that feels almost personal, and that is where your attention starts to shift, not because anything dramatic has happened, but because small patterns begin to echo in memory. The chickadee from moments earlier is still there, now slightly repositioned, not closer, not farther, but differently aligned, as if it is adjusting to something invisible between you and it. You might have felt this once before, standing near a window, noticing a bird returning to the same branch at the same time of day, or pausing just long enough for you to become aware of its awareness. It is a quiet kind of recognition, the kind that does not demand explanation but lingers anyway. And if you are still here, still watching this unfold, it is worth pausing for a moment to subscribe before going further, because what seems like a simple observation of nature slowly begins to reveal patterns that most people walk past without ever noticing, and once you start seeing them, they begin to change the way ordinary moments feel. The chickadee flicks its head slightly again, not in alarm, not in urgency, but in a rhythm that feels almost deliberate, as though it is continuing something already in progress rather than reacting to something new. And you realize, maybe without fully committing to the thought yet, that this is not the first time a moment like this has asked for your attention, but it might be the first time you have stayed long enough to notice that it is asking at all. And that is where things quietly begin to shift, because what follows next is not about what the bird does, but about what you start to realize it might have already been doing long before you ever looked closely enough to see it. At some point, while you are still standing there watching the chickadee, something begins to feel less like an isolated moment and more like a pattern that has been quietly unfolding long before you ever paid attention to it. It is not loud. It is not obvious. It is the kind of realization that arrives through repetition, through memory assembling itself without permission. You start recalling other mornings, other birds, other brief encounters that never seemed connected at the time. A small bird pausing at the edge of a feeder before committing. A sudden stillness when you stepped closer to a window. The way certain birds seem to hold their position just long enough for you to become aware of them, and then leave as if the timing itself mattered. And now, standing here again, it is difficult to ignore the possibility that what you once called random might actually be something else entirely, something structured in a way you never learned to see. The chickadee shifts slightly on its branch, not fleeing, not approaching, but adjusting with precision, as if responding to a set of conditions you cannot directly perceive. Its body remains small, almost fragile against the pale morning light, yet its behavior feels measured, almost deliberate. And that is when the idea begins to surface, not as certainty, but as a question you cannot fully dismiss. What if this bird is not simply reacting to you, but evaluating something about you that you are not aware of being tested on? You might notice how often it returns to the same position, how it pauses in the same rhythm, how it seems to recalibrate distance without ever crossing a clear boundary. These are not dramatic actions. They are subtle, almost invisible shifts that only become meaningful when you stop thinking of them as isolated events and start seeing them as part of a sequence. And in that sequence, something begins to feel less like observation and more like assessment, as if the bird is learning you in real time through behavior you do not even realize you are expressing. The yard remains quiet, but the silence now feels different, less like emptiness and more like attention held in suspension. And what makes it even more unsettling, in a quiet way, is that nothing about the bird has changed, only the way you are beginning to interpret the space between its movements, as though that space itself might be where something unseen is actually happening. And then, without forcing it, your attention begins to drift into a quieter layer of understanding, as if your mind is trying to stabilize what your instincts have already started to suggest. You think about how chickadees actually survive in environments that are full of constant risk, how every landing, every pause, every approach to a feeder is part of a continuous calculation that never truly stops. What looks like stillness is often decision-making compressed into fractions of a second. Ornithologists who study small passerine birds have observed that species like chickadees are constantly running what can only be described as rapid risk assessments, evaluating distance, movement, and safety in real time before committing to even the smallest action. It is not intelligence in a human sense, but it is precision shaped by survival. And once you understand that, the earlier moments begin to feel different. That pause on the branch, that repeated return, that slight hesitation before moving closer, they are no longer empty gestures. They become data points in a process you were never aware you were part of. There are studies from field observations showing that small birds adjust their tolerance to humans based on repeated, non-threatening exposure, gradually reducing their distance thresholds over time when no danger is detected. It is a slow calibration, almost invisible unless you are looking for it. And suddenly, the chickadee's behavior is no longer mysterious in a supernatural sense. But it is not random either. It exists in that space between instinct and learned recognition, where patterns form quietly over repeated encounters. Even its stillness begins to make sense, because in nature, stillness is rarely absence. It is often evaluation, a moment where information is being gathered without movement giving it away. And as you stand there, you begin to realize that what feels like being observed might simply be the natural outcome of a system designed to notice everything before it decides to trust anything. But even with that explanation settling in, something about the timing, the repetition, the feeling of being held in its attention still lingers just beyond what science alone can fully soften, as if understanding the mechanism does not entirely dissolve the experience itself. And yet, even with that understanding forming quietly in the background of your thoughts, something about the moment refuses to become fully ordinary. The chickadee is still there, but now it feels less like a subject you are observing, and more like a presence that has settled into the same space you are occupying. It shifts again on the branch, just slightly, and this time the movement feels less like evaluation and more like familiarity, as if the distance between you has been measured enough times that it no longer needs to be checked so carefully. You notice how small the details become when you are this close to paying attention. The way its feet adjust on the bark, the way its body tilts ever so slightly when the wind passes through the thin branches above, the way it occasionally pauses, not to flee, but to simply remain still in a way that feels almost shared between you and it. And without realizing it, you begin to mirror that stillness yourself, holding your own movement just a little longer than you normally would, as if breaking the moment too quickly would disrupt something neither of you has fully defined yet. There is a strange kind of quiet connection forming in the absence of action, not spoken, not explained, but felt in the space where attention becomes mutual. You start to wonder, not in a dramatic way, but in a soft and hesitant way, whether this is what it feels like when something wild stops seeing you as unknown and begins seeing you as simply there. The Chickadee remains, unchanged in form but different in meaning now, and the yard around you seems to shrink into something more intimate, as if everything else has stepped back just enough to leave only this shared moment between breath and stillness. And in that stillness, it becomes harder to tell where observation ends and recognition begins, because something about the way it stays makes you feel, almost quietly, like you are no longer the only one aware of the moment unfolding. And as you remain standing there, something in the atmosphere begins to extend beyond this single moment, as if what you are witnessing is not contained to this morning alone, but connected to something larger that has been unfolding without your awareness across time. The Chickadee is still present, but now each small movement feels like part of a longer sequence, a pattern that does not begin or end where you are currently standing. You start to notice how it does not simply arrive randomly, but seems to return with a kind of consistency that feels almost structured, as if the same invisible conditions are being checked again and again before it commits to being here. It pauses, shifts, and repositions in a way that feels less like hesitation and more like confirmation, as though something about this space is being verified through repetition rather than discovered anew each time. And slowly, your attention drifts outward from this single interaction into the idea that this might not be the first time this has happened. Not just today, but across other days you may not have fully registered in the same way. The memory of earlier encounters begins to surface differently now, not as isolated moments, but as connected instances of a behavior that seems to refine itself over time. Even the silence around you begins to feel less empty and more structured, like a pause between evaluations rather than a lack of activity. The Chickadee tilts its head once more, holding still in a way that feels increasingly intentional, and in that stillness, there is a sense that something is being measured beyond what you can directly see. It is no longer just about whether it stays or leaves, but about what it has been determining through every return, every pause, every moment of watching that you were never fully aware was part of a process. And as this realization settles in quietly, one question begins to form at the edge of your awareness, almost unspoken but impossible to ignore. What exactly has it been learning each time it comes back to you? And at some point, the feeling begins to shift again, not away from clarity, but deeper into something that clarity alone cannot fully contain. You are still watching the Chickadee, still grounded in the same quiet yard, the same pale morning light, but the meaning of the moment no longer feels confined to what is directly visible. It feels extended, as if what is happening here might be part of a wider pattern that people have quietly sensed for a long time without ever agreeing on how to describe it. Many people believe that moments in nature like this carry a kind of reflection, not in a literal sense, but in the way attention itself seems to move in both directions. You look at the Chickadee, but there is a growing sense that something in the act of looking is being returned, not as thought or intention, but as presence. And that is where the mind begins to soften its certainty, not into belief, but into openness. Something about the repetition of its visits, the careful pauses, the way it returns without urgency, starts to feel difficult to dismiss as simple randomness. It is not that science is absent here, because everything you have seen so far can be grounded in behavior, adaptation, and learned familiarity. But even with that understanding, there remains an emotional residue that does not fully dissolve, a sense that the interaction carries weight beyond its physical explanation. The Chickadee remains on its branch, calm and still, as if the act of being here is enough in itself, and you find yourself wondering whether this is what it means when a living presence begins to recognize another, not through thought, but through repeated contact over time. Not as judgment, not as intention, but as a quiet accumulation of awareness that neither side fully names. And in that space between explanation and experience, something subtle lingers, something many people describe in their own way when they talk about nature feeling responsive, almost aware, in moments that arrive without warning but stay in memory far longer than expected. And as you stand there, still caught in that quiet exchange, one thought remains, gentle but persistent, that perhaps what is unfolding is not about being judged or chosen in any final sense, but about what it means to be noticed at all, in a world that rarely pauses long enough to look back. And then, without anything new happening in a dramatic sense, The moment begins to settle into a quieter form of understanding, as if everything that needed to be noticed has already been seen, and now only the meaning of it remains. The chickadee is still there, but even its presence feels softer now, less like an object of focus and more like part of the atmosphere itself. It is no longer demanding attention in the same way, and yet it does not disappear. It simply exists in a kind of balance with the space around it, as if it has reached a point where movement is no longer necessary to communicate anything further. You find yourself breathing more slowly without realizing it, matching the stillness that has taken over the yard. The branches no longer feel like separate objects, but like part of a larger quiet system where everything holds its position just long enough to be noticed. There is no urgency left in the moment, only continuation. And in that continuation, something subtle begins to form, not as a thought, but as a recognition that nothing here has actually changed except the way you are experiencing it. The chickadee remains, unchanged in form, yet the meaning of its presence has softened into something almost difficult to define, like an impression left behind after a sound has already faded. Many people describe moments like this in nature as strangely grounding, not because something external has shifted, but because something internal finally stops resisting what is already there. And as you stand in that quiet space, it becomes less about what the bird is doing and more about what you are no longer trying to interpret, as if for the first time. The act of simply witnessing is enough without needing anything to resolve. The yard, the light, the still air, even the faint movement of the chickadee, all seem to exist in the same gentle rhythm now. And for a brief moment that feels longer than it should, everything feels held together, not by explanation, but by attention itself. And in the end, nothing truly dramatic changes in the yard. The chickadee does not announce anything, does not perform any final gesture, does not leave behind a sign that would make the moment easier to interpret. It simply remains for a few more breaths of time, then shifts once, lightly, almost as if concluding something only it was aware of, and lifts away into the pale morning air. The branch it leaves behind moves slightly, then settles, returning to stillness, as if nothing had ever disturbed it at all. But the space it occupied does not feel empty in the same way anymore. Something about it feels remembered, as if attention itself has left a trace that cannot be seen but can still be felt. You stay there for a while longer, not because you are waiting for anything specific to happen, but because the silence now feels different than it did before. It feels complete in a way that does not require explanation. And as you finally begin to turn away, there is a quiet sense that what you experienced was never about a single bird or a single moment, but about the subtle way life sometimes seems to notice you back when you are not expecting it. Many people would call it instinct, others would call it coincidence, and some would simply say it was just a chickadee moving through its day. But even as those explanations make sense, they do not fully erase the feeling that something in that exchange carried a meaning that lived just beneath language, just beyond certainty, in the space where awareness meets something you cannot quite name. And so it stays with you, not as an answer, but as a quiet question that continues long after the yard has returned to its ordinary rhythm. Thank you for staying until the end and sharing this moment together. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, take a moment to subscribe before you leave, because there are still countless small encounters happening all around us every day that most people pass by without ever realizing they were part of something deeper, something quietly unfolding just beyond attention. And as this story fades, it does not truly end here, because somewhere out there, in another quiet yard under another shifting sky, something small and living may be pausing for just a moment longer than expected, and perhaps even now, it is noticing you in a way you have not yet learned how to notice back.